So you join me mid-session where me and a bunch of lads, we've headed down to Stanwick Fisheries, and the lake we're actually fishing is Elson's Lake. So if anyone's ever been here before, you'll understand that it's a really, really weedy lake. Lots of Canadian, lots of silkweed, and more importantly, a lot of nice carp. So in this short piece, I'm going to run through how I would target and actually fish and present baits and rigs in the weed, because carp love spending all the time in the weed, and more importantly, they love feeding in it as well. I've actually had a couple of fish already this session, one of the lake stockies, followed by one of the lake's big ones at 40 pounds 7 ounces, and that was fishing in the weed. So what I'm going to do in this short piece is I'm going to run through how to find the best areas to fish in the weed, the rigs you would use, the baits, presentation, the lot, so hopefully you can bring that into your own angling and catch fish out of the weed. So you found your swim and you want to get your rods out, but the first thing you've got to do is you've got to find zones out in the weed that is more presentable than others. And the hardware you need to do that is definitely your marker rod, just with a lead, and more importantly, you're going to need braid because it has zero stretch and you're going to feel everything that's going on out on the lake. So talking of weed, and what you're looking for is we're looking for the lighter patches of weed, because as I mentioned, it's absolutely chocker of weed out here in Elson's, and I want to get some sort of drop. I don't want to be fishing in the massive Canadian, I want to be fishing in the sort of light silkweedy sort of spots. So that's exactly what I done when I got here. Had a good lead around with the marker rod, and I actually found a spot at about 10 wraps out where I was getting a nice clean donk. Don't get me wrong, it wasn't like the donks you get when you're fishing gravel, it wasn't a crack down, but the lead was actually hitting down and I was getting a nice firm thud. So I investigated that area a lot more, and I found actually to the left of it, I was getting an even harder drop. I was fishing in probably about 8-9 foot of water, and it was pure silt. A lovely drop. And as I went more right, it got a little bit shallower and a little bit more weedy, but perfect amount to fish baits on and rigs on. So that's what I done. I took the rod, put it around the distance sticks, wrapped it out, found it was 10 wraps. Put one on the lovely clean silt area, one in the middle rod, which was a light silkweed, and then one on the right was a little bit heavier silkweed. But the first night, I actually got two takes, as I mentioned earlier, that little 7-pounder and a 40-pounder, and they both came off the middle and the right rod, which are fished in the silt. So there you go, sorted with the spots. Let's talk about rigs. So the spots are sorted, let's talk about rigs. And in my opinion, the helicopter rig is definitely the way to go when you're fishing in weed, and mainly because you've got this adjustable top bead here. You can slide up and down your lead core to gauge how deep your silkweed is. So what I done, when I was leading around, I was bringing in bits of silkweed, taking it off the lead, and you sort of get a gauge of how deep the silkweed is. And in my case, it was about 10-12 inches. So I've adjusted this top bead up to suit the depth of the weed I'm fishing in. When you do cast out, the rig's going to fly up to that top bead, your lead's going to go down to the bottom, and then your rig should settle on top of the silkweed. So talking of rigs, pretty simple, everyone's seen it before. It's a hinge stiff rig. It's got a fluorocarbon boom here, and then on the chod section here, I've got a bright white tuna hook bait on there, nice and potent, and that will just sit on top of the silkweed. So I'm fishing 3 rods on the spot, and what I like to do when I first turn up is sort of mix the hook baits up. So I've got a white tuna on there, and then I've got to match the hatch on the other 2 rods as well, so I can either decipher which one is doing the bites on the given day. So there you go, nice and simple, but really important to get your rig choice right when fishing in the weed. Right, so you've got your spot sorted, you've got your rig sorted, and the last piece of the jigsaw, and as equally as important to the other 2, is bait and bait application. So for me, I like to use hinge stiff rigs, and it lends itself perfectly to fishing with boilies. And that doesn't change if I'm fishing a gravel pit on the nice hard stuff, or if I'm fishing in the weed, I always use boilies. Coming into the summer months like we are now, there's no other choice for me than the Pacific tuna. But don't get me wrong, I don't use this straight out the bag when fishing in the weed. Because it's round, it's heavy, you put it out, it is going to sink down to the lake bed and not sit on top of the weed like our rig and rig presentation has. So, pretty simple. I grab a chopper of some description and I get those baits in half, because once they're halved and they go out into the lake bed, they just flutter down and they'll present themselves on top of the weed exactly like our rig does. So if you're fishing close in, obviously with the halves, you can just hand them in. But if you're fishing more than probably sort of 6-7 wraps out in the lake, you're gonna wanna use the spom. Get that bait out nice and accurately over those rigs and they'll flutter down, landing on top of the silkweed, perfectly where your rig is. Well, there you go, that's proof in the pudding that you can catch fish out the weed, be it only a small one. It's still proof in the pudding that actually fishing in the weed can get you bites. Not complaining, a couple of small ones and a big old 40 fishing in the weed for my trip here at Ansell. So hopefully you can get something from this video, go to your own lakes, fish in the weed confidently and get some fish on the bank.